For some reason, phone manufacturers believe that humans are mutating at an alarming rate. They seem convinced that the human hand is growing in size every single year. Because how else can you explain the year on year releases where these companies keep launching ever so slightly slimmer smartphones with steadily scaling screen sizes? And they do it so cleverly, right? They increase the size just enough for it to be marketable and noticeable, but not by an amount that would ring any alarm bells. Take the jump on each individual iteration, for example. They increase the size just by a few millimeters, but those millimeters accumulate over the years. Imagine if we went from the size of an iPhone 5 to the size of an iPhone 16, it would just not be acceptable to the market. We would call it absurd. But increase it a tiny amount every year, and suddenly we seem to forget that huge handhelds are actually horrendously harder to handle. In most cases, this is to everyone's detriment because there is no particular advantage of having a larger phone unless that is your only screen. Majority of the people have a secondary screen to accompany their phone. For example, a tablet, a laptop, a desktop, or a TV, but they have something. So why do we need larger and larger phones? So we can see our reels on a bigger screen? These phones are harder to carry, they are heavier to hold, they are more difficult to pocket. You have to awkwardly perform hand gymnastics just to get around the basic navigation on your phone. It is truly a subpar experience, and yet we take pride in holding semi tablets to our cheeks in 2025. Back then, Apple saw this market gap created by the upward trend of phone sizes and cleverly decided to foray into the small phone market with the launch of the 12 mini. This is the one thing that people had been craving for a very long time, a smaller smartphone with the comparable specifications of a flagship phone. And Apple delivered. Sort of. Apple introduced the 12 mini with a lot of pomp and show, having its own dedicated section in the launch video. I still remember watching the video when it came out, when they were opening these boxes within boxes like a Russian doll sort of a fashion, and when it came out, people lost their shit. Masses swore that this is the phone that they had been waiting for, and the hype was real. When it released, people truly loved this phone. Everyone was instantly excited for it because at the time, getting a smaller smartphone meant compromising in one area or the other. It would either be a stripped down version of its flagship cousins or it would just be a budget phone. Somehow, phone manufacturers had collectively decided that top end specs belonged only in their largest phones. In this landscape, the 12 mini was a breath of fresh air. Apple checked all the boxes.
With its compact size, the iPhone 12 mini has the exact same features as iPhone 12. You're just choosing between two great sizes.
The entire 12 lineup was very similar. All the phones had the same Face ID, the same notch, there was no dynamic island on the Pro models yet. All the models had the exact same industry leading 60Hz refresh rate, the same screen technology, the same front facing camera, and even the same chip. Yes, Apple gave all the iPhones in this lineup the exact same brains. It felt so nice knowing that you would not be compromising on processing power if you were to buy a smaller phone that year. The only real difference between the Mini and the Pro that year was the fact that the Mini had a smaller battery, which was understandable, and it had one less camera. But that's it. Today, the budget lineup and the Pro lineup are ever more differentiated. The Pro lineup gets access to a more heavy duty chip, a better refresh rate, a better screen, in addition to having an extra telephoto lens and a bigger battery. But back in the days of the 12, it was just the battery and one less camera that was lacking on the 12 mini. Rest, everything was the same. And in all honesty, the camera was not that big of a deal anyway for the average consumer. Apple's software did a phenomenal job in the background at managing modest amounts of zooms for most everyday use cases like uploading a picture on Instagram or sending a Snapchat. Okay, so then what was the issue with the Mini, you might ask? It has to be the battery, right? Well, it was and it wasn't. While it is true that the 12 mini did indeed die really fast, because the battery was the size of a peanut thanks to the phone's smaller form factor. But in my opinion, that alone was not enough to flop the Mini. I feel if the Mini was released again today with the same battery or even a slightly better battery, it might have a much better fighting chance. The reason?
Introducing MagSafe for iPhone.
MagSafe. You see, the problem back then was that there was not a single convenient solution in sight to mitigate this battery issue. Today, we are flooded with so many third-party MagSafe compatible battery options. Some of you watching this may be too young to remember, but back in the Nokia days, we could actually remove the battery of the phone when it died and just insert a new battery and you would instantly be at 100% battery. The MagSafe battery pack is like the new age version of this. And I believe if the MagSafe ecosystem had been developed and affordable back then, things would have been different. Perhaps the Mini could have had a fighting chance. But when the 12 Mini was released, MagSafe was also just introduced for the very first time along with it. So the ecosystem had not taken off yet. So the early adopters who purchased the 12 Mini had only one of the three options. They could either carry around a wired battery pack, which would be very inconvenient because they would have to carry a battery pack, a phone, and a wire. Or they could carry a phone charger with them. This would be highly unreliable though because they would have to depend on the availability of phone charging sockets. Or finally, they could shell out extra money for Apple's expensive MagSafe battery pack, which would kind of defeat the purpose of a budget smartphone in the first place. But Apple was quick to respond.
iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 mini.
The next year, they released the 13 mini and they addressed this battery issue. It seemed like Apple was really listening to customer feedback actively and they really wanted this lineup to succeed. Which makes sense because they would have already spent a huge amount of money in R&D and in setting up the production line for this tiny smartphone. But the demand was still not there. Wait, what? Didn't we just establish that the battery life was one of the main reasons it did not succeed? So why were people still not buying it? Well, the battery was just one third of the picture. This is where years of marketing did not work in Apple's favor. You see, for years, Apple had been glamorizing the fact that each year they were making a bigger and better phone. Bigger and better. They subconsciously linked the two in a customer's mindset. Moreover, because of the 12 mini, this thought process was further reinforced. People had lost their confidence in smaller phones to begin with, and you could get a bigger screen for just $100 more. Why wouldn't you? And we had been filled with this notion that bigger is better for an entire decade of marketing. And marketing gets really deep rooted.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
Search for the blind Coca-Cola experiment, where people were blindfolded and asked to taste two different soft drinks, and they did not have a strong preference for either. But the moment they could see the Coca-Cola logo, they had instant preference for it, and they were even convinced that it tasted better. It can be argued that as a direct result of Apple's long-standing marketing, a lot of people mindlessly bought into the bigger is better model without ever thinking twice about what exactly would they do with the bigger screen, because they were so convinced that bigger is better. The final nail in the coffin was the complexity that comes along when you're trying to make a smaller smartphone.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave!
You have to understand that producing a compact device is much more difficult than creating a larger one. You have to shrink everything down and pack all the components into a much smaller form factor, while still ensuring that it remains competitive with its larger siblings. Maintaining this fine balance between reducing screen size and ensuring that the phone is still on par with its bigger brothers is a very difficult game to play. It would have been easy to make a smaller phone with a lot of compromises and call it a day, but Apple did not do that. Apple genuinely tried to give us a small size flagship level smartphone, and it failed nonetheless. So Apple simply chose the easier route. Instead of maintaining three separate assembly lines, Apple just decided to kill the Mini and simplify their production line into two assembly lines, one for the regular sized phones and one for their bigger models. In summary, the Mini died because of a combination of factors. The lackluster battery that the original Mini line was introduced with, the lack of a comprehensive MagSafe ecosystem, years of marketing that had fed the idea to the people that bigger is better, and we voted with our wallets for that. And finally, shrinking tech is really hard, and it didn't make sense for Apple to continue putting resources into a failing lineup which had very little ROI. But even after all this time, the Mini still remains a beloved last stand representing tiny flagships in the land of giants. The love for pocketable, easily manageable smartphones is real. And perhaps the technology today has come far enough that we might once again see smaller phones with flagship level specs and a decent battery life once again. Maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but I truly believe that a phone should be a phone. Some of the grey hair amongst you might recall that phones used to be called mobile phones. Mobile. Portability and convenience was the reason this product category was invented. It never meant to be a be-all do-all device. Companies justify larger screens saying that you can be more productive, but you really can't. Squinting your eyes at a tiny screen to get something done in a much less efficient manner is not productivity. But that's just me. If you like the iPhone mini, chances are you may also like minimalism. I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize for that. But if you do like to use your smartphone in a mindful and minimal manner, You can check out the video linked here and in the description below, which shows you how to do just that. Oh, and if you click the like button below this video, it will help my future videos show up on your feed more consistently. So, until the next one.